A Florida woman seen on camera beating her 3-year-old son has avoided any prison time. We are taking a look at what some are calling a sweetheart deal with former Miami prosecutor Melba Pearson. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. We first told you about 29-year-old Yulia Storozhuk last November after she was seen on a neighbor's camera assaulting her young son. Horrible footage, really, really tough to watch, because in the neighbor's ring footage, Storozhuk can be seen grabbing her 3-year-old son, lifting him off the ground, throwing him back down. She's also seen kicking, shoving him, causing him to fall backwards and hit the floor. The boy was reportedly covered in scratches and bruises, so he was removed to stay with a foster family. We actually spoke with Detective Javier Estevez last fall when he was the one who helped arrest Storozhuk. He was one of the detectives who responded to the report made by the woman's neighbor. Take a look.
Initially, she called the police department the night prior, and it appears she had some sort of a nervous breakdown and did not want to be in the custody or was asking for help, financial help for her child. Officers responded and investigated. There was no signs at the moment of any injuries or anything. The child was asleep in bed. The next morning, a concerned neighbor who saw the horrific video. It's one of the worst things I've seen in 22 years as an officer. The neighbor came by and shared the video from their doorbell camera, and we were able to see all the footage that everyone saw. The neighbor said that they'd heard screaming coming from the apartment. They never imagined it was from a child. When you watch the video, in an eerie way, the child is very tolerant of the suffering which leads me to think that this occurred more than once. We went in and checked on the kid, and we put 2 and 2 together, and we took her into custody. At that point, she was hysterical and begging us not to take her. She didn't know what it was about. When we talked to her outside, we didn't want to talk to her in front of her roommate. She became apologetic and said this is the only time that that's happened.
But now, despite all of that, Storozhuk has reached a plea deal with Miami-Dade County prosecutors and entered a guilty plea last week to 2 counts of child abuse. But here's the kicker. She will not be going to prison for her actions. Instead, she was sentenced to 3 years probation. I want to bring in former Miami prosecutor Melba Pearson to talk more about this. Melba, thanks so much for coming on. First, before we even get into the legal aspects of this, what is your reaction to seeing the video and these accusations against Storozhuk? Because it's pretty horrible.
Yes, Jesse, thank you so much for having me on. Always great to chat with you. And yeah, the video footage was heartbreaking, gut-wrenching. To think that a grown woman is slamming a baby, because that's literally a baby, slamming this baby around because she was angry or whatever it was that was going through her head was just appalling to see. And, it's a lucky thing that he was not injured more than he was, because of the fact that, the child's body is still developing and their, skulls are still a little soft. So it's very easy for them to have much more severe injury as opposed to somebody older. So thankfully, he was not injured more, but this was just horrific to see.
Hey, we're going to get right back to this story and really what a story it is. But let me just take a minute to thank our incredible sponsor here on Sidebar, who helps make episodes like this happen, Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury law firm. Look, if you should find yourself in a position where you're hurt and you need legal representation, Morgan & Morgan, a firm with over 1,000 attorneys, may be who you want in your corner, because they are specialists in this area. And you know why they're so big? Because they win a lot. In fact, recently they secured multiple million-dollar verdicts and settlements for victims who were in life-altering car crashes. The whole process, by the way, including starting your claim, can be done right from your smartphone. It's so easy. Also, their fee is absolutely free. You only pay them if you win. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar. And this mom, who apparently worked as a stewardess on a super yacht, previously told the court through an interpreter, because she's from Ukraine, I'm very sorry, I'm a single mom, and it was only one incident where I Left my emotions get the better of me. Now, people would see this and say, Melba, throw the book at her. She deserves absolutely no sympathy. But here, she's getting 3 years probation, no jail time. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that's a very low plea. I can understand that there is that potential of maybe someone having mental health issues or just literally not knowing how to parent. But I kind of feel that not kicking your kid is a basic tenet of parenting. I don't think you really need a class to tell you that. So I think there's something deeper going on here. I would have liked to have seen more psychological evaluations to
Well,
look at her stability.
so let me amplify that a little bit, so we know what the terms of this deal are before we even get into it, right? So she has to pay more than $1,000 in court fees as part of her probation condition. She's going to have to take a parenting class. She's going to have to undergo a mental health evaluation. As I mentioned, she's from the Ukraine. She could potentially face deportation if she violates these conditions. And the judge in this case, Judge Carmen Cabarga, told the court during sentencing that looking at the video, this warrants jail time. But she also reviewed a psychologist's recommendation that Storozhuk eventually should be reunited with her son. And she told the mom that you cannot physically discipline him again if she does regain custody, because if the court finds out she did this, she would face punishment. In fact, the court said, if you lay a finger on this child, you're coming back before me. And then she also said, the maximum I can sentence you is 10 years. The minimum I will sentence you to is 22 and a half months in state prison for a finger. So she's very clear, this judge, that if you touch this boy again, you're going to jail. You're going to prison. But I laid out some of the conditions. With that in mind, what do you think about it?
Yeah, so again, I'm very curious to know what the psychologist report said in terms of what her mental state was. I know that the recommendation was reunification at some later point in time, but what type of counseling does she need to get to that point of reunification? Like, it feels to me that a lot has to be done between now and then, and we're nowhere close to her being ready to assume parenting duties over her child. Again, the parenting class, not trying to trivialize, because there are a lot of people who do get good value out of attending a parenting course. But again, it's pretty basic. You shouldn't kick your child. So I am not quite seeing how this is really justice for this poor young child who may end up back in this situation. And
Right.
the deportation aspect is a bit questionable, because I will admit that I am not an expert in crimigration, as we call it, immigration law that has to do with criminal convictions. But the question would be, is child abuse considered a crime of moral turpitude? And that could lead to deportation, but she would be deported back to a war zone. So I think it's highly unlikely she would be deported.
That's interesting. But let me ask you this, in the sense that you've seen these cases before. What would have been something that came out in that evaluation that told the judge, you know what, I think this should be a situation where prison time is not justified. We should have a situation where this mother should be reunited with her child. What could have come out in that evaluation, in your experience, that would have led the judge to say no jail time at this? Because again, it's probably confusing a lot of people.
So there are a few layers to this. I think number one, the potential in the psychological assessment could be maybe she does have a mental illness. And if she does, and it just hadn't been diagnosed and she wasn't placed on a treatment plan, that could have explained her behavior. So if you are unmedicated and you're dealing with mental illness, you're obviously going to react differently than someone who has full control of their faculties in that instance. So there's that. Secondly, in terms of the criminal history, it is highly likely that she has no criminal history. Judging by the fact that the minimum is 22 months, there's a whole formula that we use in Florida to determine what the minimum is for someone's potential prison sentence. So it sounds to me that she doesn't have a criminal history. That could be also one of the factors why she's receiving a probation plea rather than a prison plea. But again, looking at the severity of the actions and the severity of what was seen on that video, and the fact that it can be easily proven from the standpoint, you have the video, you have the defendant in court, it's a 3-day trial, I'm still at a loss to why she would be receiving such a sweetheart plea.
Well, let me ask you about that, because her defense attorney came out and said, quote, she was under an extreme amount of pressure when this happened. Again, we're not condoning what she did. She knows she's accepted responsibility, but at least now she can move on and not go to prison. So this idea of she's accepted responsibility, but she was under an extreme amount of pressure. What do you think about that?
Again, that raises a lot of flags for me, because being under pressure, that's the reality of being an adult. You're always going to have to deal with pressure and, paying bills and figuring out how to raise your child, how to, survive in this world. There's always going to be pressure. And if the way she handles that pressure is to violently abuse her child, that's a huge problem. And a parenting class is not going to solve that. So I'm very curious to see if the evaluation that's done as part of her probation leads to a treatment plan, if that is going to be something that will give her long-term support so that she does not abuse this child again. And the reality is, we were able to move forward with this case because there was video. Imagine
Right.
if there was no video. So the
Right.
judge saying, oh, if you lift a finger to harm your child again, well, if there's no video, how is anyone going to ever know and be able to hold her accountable?
That's a very, very sad truth in these cases, unless somehow the child comes out, or a teacher or neighbor or friend or family member sees bruising on the child. A lot of this goes undetected. Now, I will tell you, it doesn't mean that she's immediately going to get her child, because my understanding is she's in the middle of what's called a dependency hearing, so it's still moving through the Miami-Dade state court system. What is that? What is a dependency hearing? How does it work?
Yeah, so a dependency hearing basically is a judge in the civil court, not in the criminal court, is reviewing and deciding whether or not what is in the best interest of the child. A guardian ad litem, is what is called, is appointed for the child to speak on the child's behalf. And basically, the judge is going to have to make a decision as to whether or not the child should remain with the foster family, whether or not the child should be removed from the parent permanently, which would be termination of parental rights, or if there should be supervised visitation, when would that be appropriate? All of those different aspects as to whether or not the child should remain with the defendant, and if the child should go back to the defendant, at what cadence, at what pace, how should that reunification happen? So all of those decisions will be made separate and distinct from what happened in the criminal case. However, the criminal case will play a pivotal role in the judge's decision. That the judge will have access to any psychological assessments or reports, any reports from the probation officer moving forward, as the defendant has to report to probation and comply with all the terms. All of that will be factored into what happens in dependency court.
Let me ask you big picture to end this. Let's say after this probation, let's say after this, or even during probation, but after this determination and probation, let's say after this dependency hearing, this process, that it's determined that this woman gets her child back and he goes back to her and she injures him again. Do we blame the court system for that? Do we blame these individual courts? Because like you said, there's two different courts. There's the criminal court, there's the civil court, that were both working not together, but both making decisions that could result in her getting access to her child again. If he should get hurt at her hands again, is that a failure of the justice system? Do we blame it, or do you say, Jesse, look, this is the way our system works. Not everybody who engages in abuse should never have access to their child again, never have custody of their child again. This is just an unfortunate situation. Tell me what we should be saying if it comes out that she does this again.
I think this would be a failure of the court system if she does harm her child again, because of the fact that we had the opportunity, and I say we, meaning all the stakeholders in the criminal justice system, had the opportunity to act now. And if we get it wrong at this juncture, I look at these types of cases as homicide prevention. And if you can get it right in terms of making sure the defendant has all of the resources they need so that they don't reoffend, so that they can move on with their lives, then that's a success. But if we don't set them up for success and then things fall apart later on, we only have ourselves to blame. So that's my thought.
I hope that doesn't happen. It's a very interesting development, and we are wishing her son all the best moving forward with this, because it's really, really disheartening to see what's going on here. But we shall see what happens next. Melba Pearson, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jesse.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.